All right, good afternoon, everyone. We are honored today to welcome back to Network 2020 Dr. Richard Haass for a talk that we are calling The New Rules, the U.S. in a Shifting World Order. Before I introduce Dr. Haass, just a few words about Network 2020. We are a New York City-based nonprofit that provides a platform for nuanced conversations about global affairs, and we strive to really bring leading thinkers and doers in the international affairs space to our audiences, both in person and online. And I would say all of our audience members are leaders in their own right who are really striving to be more informed citizens. I can think of few people who are better positioned to help parse through the current moment than Dr. Haass. He has long been recognized as a leading thinker in foreign policy, from his time as Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State to his leadership of the Council on Foreign Relations for 2 decades, where he is now President Emeritus. He served as U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. He is currently a senior counselor at Centerview Partners and is writing regularly at the Substack Home and Away, which I have found to be a clear-eyed look at U.S. foreign policy. And Brian, I believe, will drop that in the chat. He has written 13 books mainly about foreign policy, and his recent one, Bill of Obligations, is a provocative guide to re-envisioning citizenship. So welcome back, Dr. Haass.
Thank you, Courtney. Call me Richard, and I look forward to the conversation.
All right, thank you, Richard. Usually I like to start with a scene-setting question, but I'd like to just switch things up today and start with the news, since I think we're all, or maybe not all of us, but many of us are waiting to hear from the readout from the call between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump, which was a call to discuss further normalization of U.S.-Russia relations and the situation in Ukraine. Curious to get your thoughts on the call, what you would expect to see, and sort of what the outlook is that you would, with the outcome that you would want to see.
I'm not going to do predictions simply because we're going to know soon enough what happened or what the two sides report happened. Let me go back to something you said in the introduction, the idea of normalization with Russia. That seems to me potentially, emphasize the word potentially, desirable. All depends upon the terms. And what concerns me, at least up to now, is my sense that the terms have been quite lenient, that it's almost unconditional normalization. And so I hope that's wrong, but that's one set of concerns. And then obviously on Ukraine, we'll see where they come out. But the mere fact that the United States seems to be spending so much time talking with Russia about Ukraine rather than with Ukraine at the table leaves me uneasy. I keep saying we want to have diplomacy that's done with them, not to them. And I understand the president wants there to be peace. So does anybody and everybody. I would think it all depends, though, on what terms. Peace per se is not, to me, a guideline when it comes to foreign policy. There's pieces that are legitimate, that are sustainable, and so forth. So you can get quote unquote peace in Ukraine, but it might not be a peace that is desirable or fair or enduring or what have you. So either the angel or the devil will be in the details. And again, we'll know soon enough. What I'd like to see is obviously not at this point. I think the most important thing is to focus on a ceasefire, an interim agreement. I'd push off a lot of so-called final status issues to later. But what I would favor now is some type of a ceasefire in place. And I believe it's essential to get there and to sustain it, that the United States keeps the spigot of military and intelligence support for Ukraine on. We don't need to, at the moment, get into questions of troops or NATO membership. That's premature. But the only way Ukraine will have the ability, I believe, to stay independent and secure, the only way that Russia will see the importance of sticking with the ceasefire is if we signal that we are with Ukraine, particularly so long as it is willing to support reasonable terms. I think one of the good things the new administration's done is move Ukraine away from the idea that peace or ceasefires could only be based upon going back to the 1991 borders. I'd love to see that, but if that's your requirement for ceasefire, we're never going to get a ceasefire. So I think the administration deserves some credit for changing the conversation. But again, we'll see what comes of the talk today and the follow-up diplomacy.
And, one of the questions that has been on the table recently has been the idea of Europe taking on its own security. I'd be curious just to get your take on whether Europe is in the position to do that, what it would take for Europe to be. What does a Europe that is solely responsible for its own security look like?
Europe isn't there now, and it will take it considerable time to get there. So let's put aside Ukraine for a second. What it would take is Europe having much more of a defense industry. European countries would need to spend more on defense, but even more important, they need to spend smarter on defense. Europe spends quite a lot on defense if you add it all up. The problem is it's not done as a European project. It's done as a French project, a British project, a German project, an Italian project, what have you. So what I would like to see is Europe, yes, spend more, but mainly spend smarter and spend in a more integrated way. That will take. You have to overcome the political obstacles, and then it just takes time to do that. You can't generate changes, either the production of equipment and so forth, much less the organization. That takes years to happen. It's one of the reasons it's while in principle it's good that Europe is going to become somewhat more self-efficient. We can have a longer conversation about why that might be good. It's unfortunate it's happening in this way. This is jammed, if you will. It's happening. The goal is to have it happen overnight, and it can't possibly happen that way. And then there's also questions about nuclear deterrence. Will the British and French nuclear forces be made available, if you will, that provide extended deterrence to other European countries? Well, how's that going to work? What are the consultative mechanisms and so forth? So there's lots of issues that people are scrambling, I don't know, or rushing to sort out in a really small amount of time. But it's good at least that it's begun, because I think we're increasingly into the post-American era of European defense. It was already happening in some ways before Donald Trump, and he has accelerated it dramatically.
Thank you. Going back to your comment earlier about Russia and the U.S. negotiating over Ukraine's head, one of the conversations that I keep hearing is this idea that the world is drifting into these spheres of power, whether it's U.S., Eurasia, China, and related to that, in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs, Michael Kimmage put forth the scenario that Trump, who's been predated by authoritarian leaders like Putin, Xi, Erdogan, and Modi, might be able to improve a deteriorating international situation with sort of this out of the box diplomacy with leaders of a similar style. So I'm curious just to get your take on the argument that in what seems to be this strong man's world, the U.S. could use a strong leader.
Look, there's a lot of speculation about it. I think what triggered it was two things. One was the benign American attitude towards Putin and Russia, seeming to pave the way to Russia having a large role in the European theater. And then secondly, all of President Trump's talk about Greenland, Canada, Mexico, Panama, what have you, a kind of neo-imperialist foreign policy of the United States, focusing somewhat on the Western Hemisphere. And people added the two together and said, there's something here that looks like less of a world order than multiple regional orders, in each case led by the strong local great power, the United States in the Western Hemisphere, Russia in Europe, presumably China in the Asia Pacific. Now, the administration hasn't said much of anything about its policy towards China, so this is all speculation. But the idea of a more spheres of influence approach is certainly a possibility. My enthusiasm for it is distinctly limited. It would be a world, I think, of greater conflict, greater proliferation. I think also, what Russia and China might be prepared to do to impose their dominance on their region. I'm not sure the United States would, much less should, in this part of the world. There'd be enormous pushback. Nationalism is a very powerful force in the world. But again, I'm familiar with the speculation, and again, I think it would be a grievous error to move the world in that direction, because also there'd inevitably be almost the seams of friction between and among the major powers. But within them, there'd be less freedom, less prosperity, and again, I think there'd be much more potential for conflict. So, I think people underestimate the value of the world that has evolved over the last 80 years. Hasn't been perfect, but it sure looks pretty good in what it's both accomplished and what it's avoided. And I fear a lot of it is being dismantled without real care or concern for what comes after. And if this is what people have in mind for what comes after, then it would be, to me, vastly inferior to what we have.
Well, you've actually done a great job, I think, chronicling changes that have predated this administration as well, because shifts have been happening for quite some time, from bipolarity to the term you coined, I think, non-polarity, to the world in disarray. Marco Rubio has been using multipolar world, others the term fuzzy bifurcation. So if it's not, these three spheres of influence, do you see any trend emerging? Is there a discernible order governing the current system of power and interests?
Well, what there's been, as you suggest, is a world of American primacy that's giving way to something. Look, the most dangerous possibility, it would simply be a messier, more conflict-defined world. That is, the United States pulled back, great and medium powers would become more assertive. That's a real possibility. Others then would say, we can no longer rely on the United States, so then we have to become more self-sufficient. Therefore, we need to think potentially about having nuclear weapons of our own. Then if countries go to nuclear weapons, one shouldn't assume their neighbors would allow that to happen in a peaceful fashion. So you need to think about both what an alternative world looks like and then the transition to it. And I would simply say that it is fraught with all sorts of considerations. But no, I haven't seen anybody in the administration or anywhere else articulate it, but implicit, I'd say, in what the administration is doing is something of a great power. I don't want to use the word concert, but some sort of great power understandings. But again, what worries me, it would allow these two major powers, Russia and China, neither of whom we have much in common with, a free hand or close to a free hand in their respective regions. So again, a concert is normally where you set up rules that govern everything. This is something much more decentralized and potentially much more dangerous. What I don't see is anything coming along that looks as good or better compared to what we've had for now, eight decades.
And along with this split that we're seeing, maybe not split, but let's say trying to leave Europe to its own security devices, the tariff escalation with neighbors, Canada and Mexico, it really seems that the players are changing. And we can debate whether or not this concept is a good one to begin with, but does the West as a concept still exist?
It's a fair question. I think it does, but one question is whether the United States is still part of it, which is an answer I never thought I'd have to give, but here you go. I think when you speak of the West, you speak of countries that are essentially liberal at home in the classical sense of the word liberal, place constraints on governments, have significant free market dimensions to their economy, want to promote a world where change happens peacefully and so forth, where aggression is not commonplace and where borders are not changed by force. So I think you still see large elements of that in Europe, potentially in parts of Asia, essentially America's allies. What's different is that there's a real question mark about whether the United States is still signing up for those things, either domestically or internationally. It's a great, I guess you'd call it irony, because it was the United States that has done so much to fashion the West after in the aftermath of World War II, to promote norms, build and sustain arrangements from alliances to international organizations or what have you. And now we seem to have moved away from it, becoming more illiberal at home, less involved abroad, certainly not as interested in trade and investment and so forth, as was sketched out or structured under Bretton Woods. So can the West survive with the United States? Essentially is no longer a central part of it. Much more difficult, but potentially. And the problem is it would lack the weight of the United States. And so it gets back to your earlier question. Could Europe do things to push back, to deter behaviors by Russia? Hard to see what would happen in Asia. I mean, either you have Chinese primacy, or you would have a situation where several countries would have to contemplate nuclear weapons of their own, including the Republic of Korea and Japan. And again, whenever one talks in those terms, one has to think about not simply the endpoint, but also the transition from where we are to something like that.
A lot to think about there. Since you last spoke to Network 2020, I would say US-China relations have gotten worse. Where do you see that relationship these days, and how is China reacting to the current US approach to the world?
Well, the relationship has gotten worse, and over the last decade or so. I still think the US-China relationship is a relationship in search of a rationale. We've had them historically. For example, for two decades, we collaborated against the Soviet Union, the last 2 decades of the Cold War. And then in the early post-Cold War years, the rationale for the relationship was essentially economic. And we would have access to China's market, their cheap goods would have access to ours, they would develop and so forth. That broke down for lots of reasons, but essentially the hope or the wish that China would evolve into a more open society, a less state-dominated economy, a more modern foreign policy, none of that came to pass. So you had real disillusionment with China and what had happened. And then beginning with the first Trump administration, then continued through the Biden administration, the United States took a much tougher approach on China in terms of export controls and so forth, but also talking more about a so-called pivot to Asia, thinking about various scenarios. That's where we are now. I don't know what the Trump 2.0 policy will be towards China. Up to now, it's been tariffs. So China, is retaliating in its own way. There's a lot of talk about a summit between President Xi and President Trump. Presumably that will happen. I don't know what would come of it. I think there's big questions. There's divisions in the officials who advise the president about China and how they perceive it. I think a big question mark is how much the Trump administration will define the relationship in economic terms as opposed to geopolitical terms, which has all sorts of consequences for the South China Sea and the Philippines, not to mention Taiwan. So I don't know. We haven't had a lot of signals. It's been all over the place on TikTok. And again, it's been somewhat confrontational on economic issues. But I don't have a feel yet for where this administration is going to ultimately come out and what would be the nature of its preparations for a high-level meeting. What their definition of success would be. There could be very different definitions of success. You could have people focusing on the trade imbalance. We import from China far more than we export to it. You could have people focusing on high tech. You could have people focusing on Taiwan or, again, the South China Sea. I simply don't know, but an awful lot will stem from that. My guess is we'll know soon enough, sometime in the next 6 months. I think that the administration will begin to reveal its hand on as to what it seeks with China, what its objectives are, how it's planning to define success. A lot of speculation, a lot of concern. A lot of people worry about its willingness to potentially trade off the geopolitical for the economic. And again, it's possible. Yeah, anything and everything is possible. But at the moment, I don't think anyone could speak with authority about it.
I'm curious just to get your take. I mean, I realize it's hard to look down the road to see what's coming, but just looking back at the history of China and how we got to where we are today, and it seemed like there were a lot of assumptions that were made in terms of what would happen with China once it's entered into the world market. I guess a two-part question here is, why do you think these mistakes happen? Let's just say maybe it was a misreading of the situation, or and do you see similar misreadings happening with theories nowadays?
Well, in the former, it'll be a subject of rich debate. I think some would say we never should have let China into the World Trade Organization and other things. I disagree. I think it was right to. Where I think we took our eye off the ball, whatever cliche you want to use, is once China was brought in, this is roughly just over 20 years ago, I don't believe we monitored it carefully. So as China was growing, I don't think we adjusted things as some of its behaviors became clear, the theft of intellectual property. We did not adjust the terms of its integration with the rest of the world. So it was too unconditional. So China essentially cherry-picked what it wanted, and we allowed it to happen. So much earlier on, I think we should have managed the relationship much, much more critically. And this was a bipartisan error, quite honestly. We also then scored, to switch metaphors now, some own goals, things like not joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If the United States had joined that, and again, this is bipartisanship, unfortunately. Bipartisanship, as an aside, is not what it's often claimed to be. Both parties can be wrong, and often are. And in the case of China, I would say in some ways were, and certainly in terms of trade. So if we had joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it would have given us a powerful base. And we could have said to China, you can have access to these markets, but only on the following terms. We never did that. So I think in many ways, you could almost say we mishandled China's rise. We contributed to it, which is not per se wrong, but we contributed to it in a way that wasn't sufficiently conditioned. I think there's a lot of wishful thinking. Also, we were focusing on other things. How would I put it? The rise of China wasn't a crisis. It was simply happening. And in government, so often your attention, how would I put it? To use yet another cliche, the urgent drove out the important. So we'd be focusing on the latest from the Middle East or something like that, but we took our eye off China because it didn't seem to be a crisis. It was a slow motion changing reality. And by the time we woke up to it, it was awfully late. So I would sort of explain it that way. And there was a lot of wishful thinking that inevitably people thought that a China that was integrated would turn out the way we wanted it to. Well, it didn't work out that way. And as it became again clear that it wasn't working out, we should have changed our policy. And for the most part, we did not do so. In terms of other, I'm not sure, like theories and all that.
Well, I'm just wondering, are there other areas where we're operating under wishful thinking right now?
Well, we did in another area, which was that people, I think the former chancellor of Germany well, it was clearly when she, thought that economic integration with Russia would bring about Russian more moderation, and so Germany and Europe developed an energy dependency upon Russia, and needless to say, it did not prevent Russian aggression against Ukraine. So I think it's interesting. It's a theory that gets regularly dashed in history. The same theory was very popular before World War One. That if the trade relationships among, say, Britain and others in Germany and so forth were so good, so mutually beneficial, it was thought and predicted that Germany would never do things that would interrupt them. That didn't work out so well. And other times throughout history, the idea that economics would provide a kind of disincentive to go to war. I think it's a consideration, but it's a consideration that tends to get overwhelmed by other interests, and that happened in the case of Russia. I think I'm not sure their theories or not. I think what's interesting about Trump 2.0 is that he does not buy into many of the assumptions or fundamentals of American foreign policy that all of his predecessors did. I mean, a good example would be the attempt to negotiate a minerals agreement with Ukraine, and saying, we gave you, he overstates how much military support we've given Ukraine, but let's put that aside, that we've given you, for argument's sake, 125 billion in military support. You owe us. Well, that's not the way we approached the Allies at the time of World War II. It's not the way we've approached others. And our whole thinking about helping allies has been, we're going to help you. It's good for you, but it's also good for us. We get a return on investment. If there's stability in Europe and so forth, this is good for the United States. That's how you repay us. So, but this president only sees these things in terms of expenditure. It's almost like he has a one-sided balance sheet and doesn't see the revenues that accrue to the United States from successfully resisting aggression in Europe. So, I could go on, but I think he looks at his inheritance, whether it's NATO or other alliances, a lot of international institutions, and sees them more as costs or burdens or restrictions rather than as something positive. So what I think, much more than Trump 1.0, the Trump 2.0 is the first presidency essentially that's outside what has been a kind of widely accepted mainstream of American foreign policy since World War II. So you can almost take it Truman through Biden, and this is now a pretty big, pretty radical departure. We certainly know what it's departing from. Coming back to our previous conversation, a little bit less clear where it will arrive.
Great, thank you. I will turn to the Q&A box shortly, but I wanted to get in one more question. You're known for being a foreign policy person, but a couple of your books, Foreign Policy Begins at Home, and more recently, The Bill of Obligations, Look Domestically. Can you talk just a little bit about what prompted you to write the Bill of Obligations, and which of the 10 obligations do you think the U.S. most needs right now?
No, I mean, I didn't set out to do it so much as it happened. But I'd always be asked the question, what worries you the most? Is it China or Russia or ISIS or Iran or what have you? And I said, no, what worries me the most is whether we're going to have the focus and unity as a country to deal with these challenges. We've had a pretty good track record, not perfect, but pretty good at dealing with foreign policy challenges. But that required a degree of unity and consensus and focus. And then increasingly, I thought it was missing. When I wrote Foreign Policy Begins at Home, I was worried about certain specific policy areas where I thought we were coming up short. One of them we've actually done pretty well on, which was energy. We've much reduced our energy dependencies. That's been a success. But other areas that I was worried about, whether it was debt to choose one, public education, and so forth, we've obviously not corrected for. And my view was that our foreign policy would only be successful abroad, both as an example, but also in generating the resources if we fix things at home. That didn't happen, with the exception of energy. So that's made us turn more inward, which is how I got in part to the Bill of Obligations, watching January 6th and so forth. It just seemed to me that things had gotten worse, not better, and that the fabric of American democracy was being torn. And that would make it impossible to project an image that the rest of the world found attractive, and it would make it extraordinarily difficult for us to have the bandwidth or the focus, much less the unity, that would be required to carry out a serious foreign policy. So I turned to it both because in and of itself, it's obviously important, existentially important, but also it was important if we were going to have a successful role in the world. And it just seemed to me what we had gotten wrong, particularly in the last 50 or 75 years, was in losing sight of that citizenship has to involve more than a demand of rights. It has to involve obligations of Americans to one another, obligations of Americans to the country and to their government. And so I came up with my 10 obligations. I mean, some are probably a good 7 or 8 of them are really behavioral on the sort of things that people can and should do. Get informed, get involved, make the country a priority before themselves, be civil. You don't need legislation to do any of these things. You don't need constitutional amendments to be civil. So there's things I put forward, and then policy-wise, there's really 2 obligations that are policy-wise. One is that civics should become a staple of our education in schools and colleges. And that second of all, there should be many more opportunities for public service, both because it's a good thing to do, but also it brings Americans together who are otherwise siloed. And one of the things that worries me about the society is we're getting redder and bluer. And we're getting divided by not just economics, by educational attainment, ideology, and then it all becomes reinforcing. So those are the 2 obligations that, if you will, are stuff of politics. But most of the obligations are simply things that people can do themselves, and they can bring that to the political marketplace, because then they could raise the expectation that people they vote for demonstrate or live up to those obligations. So it's hard to single one out. It's like asking me, which is my favorite child, the never a fair question to ask. But there are lots of things that individuals can and should do that would have immediate impact, and things like investing in civics or investing in public service. I think those are medium and long-term payoffs. But the other things, particularly getting informed and getting involved, take the recent election. Sorry to go on so long, but probably a good third of eligible voters didn't vote in the presidential election. And I don't know what percentage of those who did vote weren't particularly well informed about what they were voting for. And as we've seen, elections have consequences. So I would love to see people, the reason I made the first obligation, getting informed, I think that's the most basic, as Jefferson would argue, that I would love to see Americans get more informed, and then against that backdrop, get more involved in politics. Because again, as we're seeing, government is consequential. Who wins elections really matters.
It's a good note to end this first part of the conversation on. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A box, so I will get to as many of them as I can. We have one here. The questioner asks, is there any opportunity for soft power in this present administration? I think soft power, thinking of within the diplomatic, not the wider term of soft power. And are there experienced State Department personnel who could advise and conduct such power?
Look, if by soft power the questioner is referring to things like diplomacy, sure. I think there's massive diplomatic opportunities In Europe, we've talked about Ukraine with Iran, given how much weaker Iran is as a result of Israeli military action, potentially between Israel and Palestinians. The real question is whether the administration is willing to exercise it in what I would judge to be a constructive way. I'd simply say the jury is out there. I think soft power of sort of demonstrating who we are. My hunch is it's diminished to some extent by our politics and some of our economic performance of late. But I think there's an enormous potential for diplomacy. It all depends upon how it's how the administration decides to employ that tool. And we'll have a pretty good indication pretty soon, I would think, when it comes to Russia and Ukraine.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions here. I'll try to combine them on the U.S.-led global hegemony. So is the shift away from a U.S.-led global hegemony an inevitable and necessary evolution in international relations? And related to that, has the U.S. empire reached its shelf life? If not, why not? And would the world be a better place without the U.S. as that main leader?
Well, I don't much like the word hegemony, simply because it didn't exist. It didn't exist. It suggests a degree of dominance or control that we never had. There's been two moments where the U.S. had a great preponderance of power and potentially influence. One was in the immediate aftermath of World War II, in part because Europe was so devastated, and Asia, parts of it were devastated by the war. So the United States, I don't know, was probably roughly half of global GDP coming out of the war. And then the second time was at the end of the Cold War. And we weren't so economically dominant, though we were still first among equals, but there was no rival superpower. And so forth. I think there was a degree of inevitability that our relative position would decline. And that was simply because of what Fareed Zakaria and others wrote about, the rise of the rest. The Chinas, ASEAN, other countries, would economically grow at faster rates. It's harder for mature economies like ours to grow at the same rates as fast developing economies. There's more low-hanging fruit for the others. So whether it was China growing double digits for 3 decades or India growing at whatever it is, 7-8%, the United States couldn't compete with that given the level of maturity of our. So there was inevitable that there'd be a shift in the relative balance, and sooner or later this wealth would be translated into military things. Also there's things like energy and so forth and around the world that's found in certain places. So increasingly a world has evolved where the United States is still first among equals. It's just that others have come, their relative position has improved, even though, by the way, our absolute position has also improved. The United States economy now is much larger than it was 10 or 20 years ago. We've introduced certain technologies. Our military has improved in certain ways. So it's not like we're standing still, but it is the difference between absolute and relative positioning. So I would say, again, our absolute position has improved. Our relative has fallen. Falling relatively is not per se bad. If you think about it, the Marshall Plan and after World War II, we engineered just that. We wanted the United States to become less dominant because we understood if we were going to have economic and security partners, we needed to build up Europe and parts of Asia. We needed to ultimately rebuild Japan and Germany. So we engineered a shift in world power away from ourselves because it was in our interest to do so, which is quite interesting if you think about it. I thought it was quite brilliant in its conception, and then it was implemented rather well. What's happened now, though, has not happened in such, shall we say, or organized or intentional way. And it's happened more because, and we talked a little bit about China before, about the rise of others. The United States has made certain mistakes. Public education in this country is a tragedy. It's a real failure. We had problems with COVID. We could go down the list. We've had other issues with governance, particularly in our cities, problems at the border. It's a long list of domestic problems that we've had, and we've made mistakes in foreign policy, either where we've done too little or in many cases where we've done too much. We've overreached, like in Iraq. So I think there has been a significant shift in the world. What I think, again, is different now is you have an administration, rather than resisting further shift, is in some ways accelerating. And that, to me, is what's so unprecedented. And I'm uneasy about it, simply because I don't, at the moment, see exactly where it's going to lead and why that would be stable or more benign. So let's put aside the word hegemony, which, again, I don't think is accurate, and it's a loaded term. But you've had a world for 80 years, which is U.S. led, to use a word you used before. There is a West. There is this pool of allies and partners in Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world who we could trade and invest, often work with diplomatically, some cases militarily. And the question is that giving way now? And the United States doesn't seem particularly interested in maintaining it or cultivating it. It's almost, we see everybody equally now, friend and foe alike. We want to reduce what it is we do in the world. So, my guess is we're moving towards a world where the United States has a much less central position, and in part because we choose to play less of a role. Again, it's curious, for want of a better word, but I think it reflects this president's view that foreign policy tends to involve more cost than benefits. So he wants to dial down the extent of American foreign policy, but in some ways, it circles back to that previous conversation. If you no longer have a global order that has been largely buttressed by the United States, then I think you have less order in the world. And whether you try to substitute regional orders or simply accept greater disorder, I think that's where we're heading. By the way, people who use the phrase American hegemony and all that think that a less American-centric world is a desirable thing. I have my main reaction is be careful what you wish for. And my view is that sooner rather than later, people will come to appreciate the dangers and risks of a world that the United States is not playing a central role in.
Related to that, we're having a couple questions here about NATO and European security. So a couple that are asking whether or not NATO can exist without the United States. And one somewhat related is, would it make sense to eliminate national armies in Europe and create a European Union army, Navy and Air Force, with some nuclear force portions to remain with original countries?
Two big questions. On the latter, it's what I talked about before. I would argue that Europe needs to become less national in its armies and in its military budgets and more collective. I wouldn't organize it around the EU because that wouldn't include the British. So I would find another way to do it. But the idea that every country would take its military budget, which would hopefully be larger, just argue for whatever the number is, 2%, 3%, 4% of GDP, and devote a significant chunk of whatever that is to a collective European effort, and would, I think, be very helpful, or simply to choreograph it, to basically have much more specialization and say, you don't need such duplication in European militaries. So the issue is to really create a European force, I think, and European defense industries. I think a lot of these things would be very helpful, because right now I think the whole is less than the sum of its parts, and you always want the whole to be more than the sum of its parts. So Europe isn't there, but in principle could get there. Could you have a European NATO? in principle, I suppose, but it would take far more capability and far more trust than you now have. We're likely to get a test of it in some ways with the nuclear issue. If Europeans lose confidence in the American nuclear umbrella, which I think they have, then and you've already got the person most likely to be the new chancellor of Germany calling for talks about this, about the French and British deterrence. So I think that issue may come up first, so that you have a more talk about. It's how would I put it? You don't get rid of NATO, but because people have lost confidence in NATO, that you have at one and the same time. NATO continues, the U.S. nuclear umbrella is there, but assuming people have lost confidence in it, you'll see greater European collective defense efforts and greater focus on a European nuclear deterrent. So I think what you'll probably have, I haven't thought about it till now, is almost a phase of coexistence where you'll have a NATO of declining relevance existing and and the rise of European consultations and maybe arrangements of greater significance.
Interesting. How is the global South viewing the changes in U.S. foreign policy towards its allies, and how will those countries balance their relations given the changing dynamics coming from the U.S.?
One, I don't know. Two, I've never been a big fan of the phrase global South. It deals with one stroke dozens and dozens, over 100 countries that see things very differently. My hunch is, though, a lot of them will be affected adversely by two things. One will be the shutoff of U.S. aid. So a lot of these countries, they will face social problems as a result. Several of them will also face problems economically, because of tariffs. So my guess is this will worsen U.S. relations with many of these countries, and a lot of them who don't have the option of self-sufficiency. Very few countries really do. I would expect a lot of them to look for new partners, and I expect China would be a principal beneficiary of this. But I think it will be a very tough time for a lot of these. A lot of these countries could get even tougher if we also cut off certain types of military support, training, and so forth. So it could just be a very difficult time for a lot of these countries.
With the world becoming more multipolar, the role of Japan in shaping the world order seems to be underplayed. How do you think the U.S. can utilize the potential of Japan in a better way to realize its interest in shaping a desirable world order?
Yeah, it's a good question. I tend to agree that Japan doesn't get the recognition or respect or appreciation it deserves. I actually think Japan is this country's most important ally, in part because of Japan's the world's third largest economy, one of the 5 or so largest militaries, and it's in the same part of the world as China. And Japan plays a potentially pivotal role vis-a-vis China in any Taiwan scenario, also obviously central to any scenario involving the Korean Peninsula. So Japan has a low-key foreign policy in the way it conducts it, but my own sense is it's critically important. What I don't know, let's take a step back. Under Trump 1.0, the Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Abe, manage that relationship about as well as anybody. It's not. We'll see how his, the current prime minister manages it. We'll also, see how much trade relations worsen, and whether it's very hard to compartmentalize these things. To say, well, we're going to be an ally on security things, but we're going to have tariffs in another domain makes it very, very tough. So to me, the really interesting question is whether in both South Korea and Japan, the Trump policy begins to trigger a big internal conversation, essentially saying, what are our alternatives to strategic dependency and economic proximity to the United States? And that could lead them towards diversifying their portfolios. It could also lead them towards greater self-help, self-sufficiency. But I expect if the Trump administration does introduce not just tariffs, but raises basic questions on the security front, I think it'll kick off big debates in both South Korea and Japan, probably first in South Korea, where you've got opinion polls showing, I don't know, 3/4 or more of the people favor an independent nuclear deterrent. South Korea essentially having its own nuclear weapons. Question then is, what would North Korea and China do if South Korea were to move in that direction, and so forth. So we could be on the cusp of setting in motion all sorts of changes, and the potential that these could be destabilizing, I think is great.
Well, this is not a small question, so do with it what you can. What impact on the U.S. economy and foreign policy will new tariffs imposed on Canada, Mexico, and China have?
If I were a betting man, the tariffs that we have, the tariffs that we could have, I think these will be lose-lose. I think they'll be bad for us. I think they'll be bad for our trading partners. But we're going to find out that, particularly with things like steel and aluminum, for every job we may preserve or create in those industries, we're going to lose many times more of those jobs in industries that depend on using steel and aluminum for what they produce. So, we have far more jobs that are dependent on steel and aluminum inputs than we do in making steel and aluminum. Think about it, the construction industry, the automobile industry. So this is going to hurt the American economy. I think if I were a betting man, as I said, I would think that if the tariffs stay, or more so if they're increased, we're probably looking at classic stagflation. I think we're looking at a significant lowering of economic growth rates. They were probably between 2.5% and 3% when this administration took over. I bet you'll begin to see those come down significantly. Second of all, I think inflation will pick up. And inflation will pick up not just because of the tariffs, which raise prices, and reciprocal tariff, and others retaliate against us. But I think inflation is going to kick in as well, because of the border policy, a loss of a lot of people who otherwise would work. And by the way, there's much about the border policy I agree with. I thought the Biden administration made a historical blunder to lose control of the border. But I'm still saying that I think suddenly we'll find ourselves short of workers in agriculture and construction. Tax cuts, assuming they're extended, will also stimulate. So I think we're heading towards lower growth, higher inflation, and probably increased unemployment. As again, because of the tariffs, industries that are affected by higher cost imports will be forced to lay off, and then you've also got the government layoffs. So I think we're heading into classic stagflation. I don't have a crystal ball to give you a date, but I would think sometime this year that's going to be, unless there's massive changes in what is being introduced. I think that's where we're heading.
Right. Try to get in just another question or two, because we're getting close to the hour. This questioner writes, Fareed Zakaria recently wrote about the apparent China and U.S. role reversals, where China is emphasizing technology and innovation while the U.S. is cutting support for these. So do you agree with that assessment? And what is your outlook on the role that technology is playing in geopolitics right now?
Well, look, I mean, I worry that government support for certain types of research is falling off. And I think that's just unbelievably short-sighted. We're seeing it in the medical area potentially. A lot of technology, though, support will probably come out of the private sector. I mean, AI and so forth, as best I can tell, is not going to be dependent on government grants. But I worry about two areas. One, I just mentioned, sort of the biomedical area. The other would be energy alternatives. I worry about it falling off of government support there, which I think will mean that China will get a truly controlling position on renewables and things like solar, wind, what have you. So it all depends when it comes. You can shut down government funding or let people go, and there's a short-term budget benefit, but you've almost got to extend your analysis over years or decades. And I don't see people doing that. A lot of what I see is awfully short-sighted, and I worry about the hemorrhaging of talent. Uh, and I see whether it's in diplomacy, people leaving state or not coming into there, or at the CDC, or other, the labs, the whatever it is, the 18 or so labs that are run by the Energy Department. I worry about the focus on Doge to reduce the level of people serving and to reduce budgets. You can do that. Excuse me, you can do that. But the question is at what medium and long-term cost. So I worry about that. The other thing with technology, obviously, is AI is transformational. There's transformational things going on with other technologies, quantum, and biotech and all that. But for lots of good reasons, AI is its centerpiece. And my view is that's just a reality. And their talk about regulating it is not going to go anywhere, either domestically or internationally. The arms control parallel doesn't work. It's too important. It's too decentralized. It's happening too many places. No way the United States and China could ever agree on what would be permissible, what wouldn't. So we are essentially going to have to live with a world of pretty much unregulated AI development and then integration.
Okay. One last question. The U.S. Trump has made statements about taking over Greenland, Canada as a 51st state and bringing the Panama Canal back under U.S. control. With the through line seems to be securing access to critical minerals and trade routes. Do you think this is the underlying logic? And if so, what is your assessment of it from a national security perspective?
I don't know what the underlying logic is. I'll be honest. I haven't. And if your goal was to have greater access to minerals, well, there's something called investment and trade that gives you that. I haven't noticed that, the Panama Canal's been operating just fine. We've had a pretty good trade relationship with Canada and Greenland and other places. And if we wanted to have more access to minerals, we could do it. We were the ones who didn't approve a certain pipeline. If we were worried about Canadian fuel, or if you want to have more access to the fuel, you don't put tariffs on. I mean, we could go on and on, but you don't need to own places in order to have relationships you can be confident in. So I find it hard to understand why that would be a motive. So I can't understand the sudden enthusiasm for what you might call McKinleyism, or foreign policy where you have to own things. And the problem with owning, also, you can meet local resistance. So we've done pretty well over the last 80 years, entering into trade and investment relationships that were mutually beneficial, and they work. I worry if we introduce a sense of that we compel people, or we try to control them, we're going to build resistance, and it'll be much harder to operate any of these, whether it's mines or canals, pipelines, or what have you. So I am perplexed, I will admit. Where did this come from? Why this sudden interest in what you might call an acquisitive foreign policy? And I hope that it doesn't presage, again, an approach to the world which is premised on spheres of influence, where the strong get to do in their neighborhoods, because that would be a world that would be again, far less free and prosperous and stable. So, but I am concerned because I don't think there's an economic rationale for doing these things. So I worry if there is a strategic, quote unquote, rationale, I think it will boomerang on us if it's actually implemented.
Yes. All right. Well, on that note, let's hope for an inquisitive foreign policy instead of an acquisitive foreign policy. Richard, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to hear your insights and have you here today. Just a few quick notes before I close. Our next event is next week on the 25th. We're doing a virtual event, and we are talking about the undersea cables and Starlink and the hidden conflicts of global connectivity. And that's virtual and free and open to all. We're also doing an event next week in New York for members only that is looking at the future of Taiwan-US relations. And we are also announcing our annual gala. I'm not sure if we have a slide on that just yet, but that will be on April 29th in New York. We are a nonprofit. We rely on support to continue. So we hope that everyone who's in New York can join us. And with that, everyone, please subscribe to Dr. Haass's Substack. It really is an excellent read. And thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Courtney. Be well.
Bye-bye.